Hello everyone, Professor Krzluk here. So I've been wanting to make a video about industrial policy. And so this doesn't sound like the most exciting topic for a video, but it's been something that I've had on my mind a lot. And I've been thinking about how to incorporate it into the national security course that I'm teaching in the fall. So I wanted to make a video just kind of talking about industrial policy because it's been on my mind, and this connection between industrial policy and national security policy. And so I think the best way to introduce the topic is through a comparison between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So we have seen this pretty significant and major change in American political economy really over the past 6 years. Maybe over the past decade, but certainly over the past 6 years. And so we've seen this return of industrial policy in government decision making and even just government discussion. So for many years, maybe some of the textbooks that I learned from, and when I was still in college, when I was getting my master's degree and then my PhD, some of the textbooks we were using still talked about industrial policy in a negative sense. It had this negative reputation in American politics. Industrial policy sounded like government planning, market interference, or politicians trying to pick winners and losers. I still remember Solaris and Obama when he was trying to grow the renewable energy sector in the U.S. and how much criticism he faced for trying to pick winners and losers. So the dominant assumption has been and was that free trade and open markets and the global supply chain would produce efficiency, of course, lower costs, and holistically economic growth. However, these assumptions have weakened, especially in the mainstream discussion since the COVID-19 pandemic. We all remember hearing stories about supply chain disruptions and shortages in American stores because trade had really ground to a halt. So you might never have thought of this as industrial policy, but it falls under the political economy idea of industrial policy. And so today, policymakers, even those running for office, are increasingly talking about manufacturing, onshoring, and not just hoping that it happens, but forcefully putting forward policies to onshore. Supply chains in the news a lot again today. Semiconductors in the news a lot today. Critical minerals, steel production, pharmaceuticals, energy, and advanced technology. You hear these discussed as national security issues, not just as manufacturing. So in other words, the question is no longer just whether the United States can buy something cheaply from abroad. The question's oftentimes being framed as whether the United States can produce essential goods during a crisis. So this is where an interesting comparison between Donald Trump and Joe Biden is useful. So we know there has been this push for more industrial planning, for some government action into the markets. But Donald Trump and Joe Biden did this quite differently. So maybe at first glance, we would think that because one's a Democrat and one's a Republican, that they would just view industrial planning completely differently. But surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, both presidents have did and utilized some industrial planning. Trump's approach has been a bit more nationalist, certainly more tariff centered, and certainly more confrontational. Biden's approach was a little bit more investment centered, using subsidies, tax incentives, public spending from government coffers, and supply chain planning. So both in industrial policy, but at the outset, they do look different. But beneath these differences, these differences we can see at the outset, both administrations have moved away from the older belief that markets alone should determine the structure of the American economy. Both Joe Biden and Donald Trump have argued that the United States has allowed too much productive capacity, too much production to move overseas. And both of these presidents have treated domestic production as a matter of national security. It's kind of interesting. If you just listen to C-SPAN debates, more and more you're hearing elected officials talk about so-and-so issue is a national security concern. This or that issue is a national security concern. So this language, this idea is really becoming mainstream in the policy making process. And what's really interesting there is it's kind of on both sides of the political aisle. Not just one political party that maybe wants a little bit more government intervention, but both political parties are arguing for maybe more of a role of the government or some way to bring back manufacturing, to re-industrialize the economy. Just think of some of Donald Trump's campaign promises. So this is quite an interesting phenomenon. So when we think about what's the root of these discussions, it is really about bringing onshoring manufacturing. So let's first think about Trump's approach. So Trump's approach can be understood kind of as economic nationalism. So in this view, the United States was weakened and is weakened by trade deficits, by deindustrialization, by foreign competition, and of course by outsourcing. The concern is not only economic though, not just the loss of manufacturing jobs, but also kind of strategic. If the United States cannot produce enough steel, aluminum, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, or other critical goods, then it becomes vulnerable during military conflicts. Maybe vulnerable during pandemics like we saw with COVID-19 when supply chains were disrupted. So we saw supply chain disruptions. And importantly, what the Trump administration talks about is the U.S. would also be vulnerable during geopolitical conflicts, something we hear a lot about today with the U.S.-Iran conflict. So for Trump, tariffs have been the central tool to, in his mind, correct these shortcomings of a market economy. Tariffs raised the costs on imports, protected some domestic producers, pressured foreign governments, and gave the United States leverage in negotiations. Things that we all hear Trump talk about really quite often. So to Trump, tariffs on steel and aluminum, for example, were justified partly through national security logic. Of course, there's still the economic discussion, well, we need to bring jobs back to Ohio and Michigan. And we saw that's one of the reasons Trump did well in those places in the last election. But beyond that simple economic logic, the argument was that the United States needed a strong domestic metals industry to support its defensive industrial base, especially if confrontation with China is down the road. So this approach was pretty coercive and transactional. It treated access to American markets as a source of power. If foreign firms wanted to sell within the United States, they should produce more in the United States. If allies benefited from American markets or American security guarantees, Trump argued that they should carry more of the burden. If rivals depended on American consumers or technology, that dependence can be used strategically. So that's all fresh in our minds because we hear Trump talk a lot about these issues. We hear him explaining, we hear people from the administration explaining why tariffs are being implemented, why the administration's putting tariffs on countries, why the administration wants to industrialize here in the US. Maybe what's not quite as fresh in our memory, and what the Biden team never made as front and center as the Trump team did, is Biden's approach to industrial policy. He also treated industrial capacity as a national security issue, but it looked different in practice. How it was talked about was different, and the way that Biden tried to grow the industrial base looked quite different. So Biden, rather than relying mainly on tariffs, emphasized public investments and subsidies, tax credits, procurement, infrastructure, and supply chain resilience. So there are some major examples from the Biden era: the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. The logic behind these policy decisions and these policy implementations is that markets alone may underinvest in sectors that are strategically important. Semiconductor manufacturing is really probably the best example here. Chips are essential for military systems, for communications, cars, artificial intelligence, even our consumer products, our consumer electronics. Much of the modern economy, chips are an important piece of it. But chip production does require enormous investment, specialized workers, and complex supply chains. If firms can produce more cheaply abroad, or if other governments offer stronger subsidies, private companies may simply produce overseas. So from Biden's perspective, that created a national security problem. So what did Biden do? So Biden's model looked different than simple protectionism. It was more about development in a developmental style of policy making. So for Biden, under the Biden administration, the government identified sectors that were important for national security competitiveness, then tried to encourage, nudge, offer the carrot for private investment in those sectors. The goal was not to just block imports through tariffs. The goal was to build domestic capacity, again, through incentives to get private money, private enterprise to build infrastructure, to build production within the United States. So here we see that the Biden team still was working on trying to grow domestic economy, but it looks different. Again, Trump building trade barriers, tariffs, and the idea was then you would have more investment in the United States. You would have it would be expensive to import, so a more industrial growth at home. Biden, instead of building those trade barriers, was trying to spend money domestically, trying to incentivize more investment, more money being spent in the economy, and thus the industrial capacity would grow that way. So both presidents were trying to build an industrial infrastructure, but here we see that it's different. So we know that Trump, emphasized tariffs, emphasized economic nationalism. Biden emphasized investments, subsidies, maybe even infrastructure. And so both presidents surprisingly believed in industrial policy, which is quite a change from earlier even recent times, where industrial policy was kind of taboo, and many policymakers thought it was better simply to allow the market to dictate where industry was created, where factories and were constructed, and you could just trade. But we've seen over the past decade, especially since COVID-19, and this idea that there might be more confrontation with China, more industrial policy is being implemented in the US. Thank you.